What if I told you that the most formidable weapon of the Viking Age was not born in the mountains, but in quiet, rusty swamps? The great swords that became the symbol of an entire era began their journey not as shiny steel, but as unremarkable mud and peat sludge. This is the story of how Scandinavian blacksmiths, balancing on the edge of craftsmanship and ancient knowledge, turned bog ore into the perfect weapon. Watch this video to the end, and you'll learn what secret ingredient was more important than the metal itself, and why creating a sword was considered a battle with the forces of nature. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret. For a Viking, a sword was much more than just a weapon. It was an extension of the soul, a symbol of status, and a guarantee of personal freedom. In Scandinavian society, where law and power were often inseparable, possession of a sword distinguished a free man from a slave. It was the most expensive possession that not every warrior could afford. The cost of a good blade could be equivalent to the cost of an entire farm or several head of cattle. A sword was not just a tool, it was a companion, almost a member of the family. Warriors gave their blades loud and formidable names, such as Odin's Flame or Snakebite. These names reflected the character of the weapon and the belief that metal had its own spirit. The sagas are full of stories about swords that sang in battle or thirsted for battle, which shows a deeply personal attitude towards them. Such a blade could not simply be bought. It could only be earned, inherited, or received as a gift from a jarl. This personification was linked to the incredible complexity of its manufacture. In an era when most weapons, such as axes or spears, were relatively simple to produce, the sword was the pinnacle of technological artistry. It required not just skill from the blacksmith, but true mastery and a deep understanding of fire and metal. Each blade was unique, embodying the reputation and skill of the master who created it. The sword was inextricably linked to the honor of the family and was passed down from father to son. Losing the family sword was considered an indelible disgrace, equivalent to losing the family honor. Finds in burials show that noble warriors were buried with their swords, which were often ritually bent. This was done in order to kill the weapon so that it could follow its owner into the afterlife and no one else could take possession of it. This almost sacred status of the blade explains why blacksmiths went to incredible lengths to create it. They did not simply forge iron, they performed a ritual in which dead ore was transformed into living steel. Each stage of this process was steeped in tradition and superstition. Success depended not only on skilled hands, but also on the favor of the higher powers that patronized the blacksmith's craft. That is why the search for raw materials for a future masterpiece was in itself like a mystical quest. Blacksmiths were not just looking for iron, they were looking for the right iron. They believed that metal born in certain places had special properties, and paradoxically, the best blades came from the darkest and most unassuming places, in swampy, rusty marshes. Does this belief in the living spirit of metal seem like mere poetry to you? Or was there a rational grain of truth in it that reflected the value of the object? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about where the iron for these legends actually came from? Contrary to popular belief, the Vikings of Scandinavia hardly mined ore in the mountains. Their main source of iron was inconspicuous swamps and lakes. This material, known as bog iron, or lake ore, was a true gift of nature, available to those who knew where and how to look for it. The formation of this resource is a slow, natural process that takes decades. Groundwater flowing through the soil washes out iron compounds. In marshy areas, special iron bacteria absorb these compounds and concentrate them. As a result of the activity of these microorganisms, iron is deposited in the form of solid oxides and hydroxides at the bottom of swamps, lakes, or in layers of peat. This material is not like classic mountain ore. Most often, it consists of small, porous concretions or entire layers of rusty brown or black color. At first glance, it could simply look like dirty stone or hard, rusty earth. Only an experienced eye could recognize these unassuming pieces as valuable raw material for a future blade. Mining bog iron was hard and dirty seasonal work. The best time for this was late autumn or winter, when the bogs froze over and could be approached. People probed the bottom of the swamps with long poles to find solid layers of ore by touch. Then they broke it off and brought it to the surface using shovels and hooks. Surprisingly, this resource was renewable. In those swamps where the ore was completely depleted, it could form again after a few decades. This allowed entire settlements to exist on the same swamp for many generations. People learned to harvest iron in the same way they harvested crops from the fields. After extraction, the ore was not ready for smelting. It was saturated with moisture and mixed with mud, peat, and other organic impurities. Before sending it to the furnace, the ore had to be prepared. It was washed and dried, then subjected to primary roasting on an open fire. This dirty, fragile material seems like the complete opposite of a shiny sword. How many hours do you think it took to simply extract it? But extracting the ore is only the first step. In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of how the Vikings turned this rusty dirt into pure metal using only clay, fire, and wind. What I am about to show you was considered not just work, but a sacred ritual. In the Viking Age, the blacksmith was one of the most respected and at the same time mysterious figures in society. He was not just a craftsman, but a master who commanded the four elements: the earth from which he took ore, the fire that melted metal, the water that tempered it, and the air that fanned the flames. His craft was on the borderline between technology and magic. The smithy, or smithy, smidja, was a special place. It was often located on the edge of a settlement, away from residential buildings. This was due not only to the risk of fire, but also to the sacred status of this place. The smithy was considered a space where the world of humans and the world of spirits met, and the blacksmith acted as a mediator between them. Working with fire and metal was considered a task that required not only physical strength, but also spiritual purity. Scandinavian mythology is full of stories about legendary blacksmiths, such as Völund, who was both a great master and a powerful sorcerer. It was believed that the best blacksmiths knew special spells or runes that helped them create perfect weapons. The process of smelting and forging was fraught with enormous risks. In addition to the obvious dangers of fire and hot metal, there was also a hidden threat. When coal burned in the confined space of the furnace, carbon monoxide was released. Prolonged inhalation of these invisible vapors could lead to poisoning, which probably gave rise to legends about smithy spirits that demanded caution. The secrets of the craft were kept strictly confidential. They were not written down but passed down exclusively by word of mouth, from master to apprentice, often within the same family. Losing a master blacksmith was equivalent to losing an entire library of unique knowledge for the community. Each dynasty of blacksmiths had its own signature techniques and recipes for working with metal. For the average person, the transformation of rusty dirt into a shiny and durable blade was a real miracle. They did not understand the chemical processes taking place in the furnace. They only saw how the blacksmith persuaded or tamed the unruly metal with fire and a hammer. This gave the blacksmith an aura of a person with supernatural abilities. This sacred role of the master who commands fire is one of the most fascinating details of the era. If you also feel respect for this ancient craft, please like this video. What if I told you that the first smelting was more like cooking than metallurgy? The process of turning ore into metal did not take place in huge blast furnaces, but in modest bloomery furnaces, or domes. These furnaces were temporary structures built specifically for one or more smeltings, often right next to the ore mining site. The design of such a furnace was ingenious in its simplicity. It was usually a low shaft, about 1 to 1.5 meters high, built from local clay mixed with stones, sand, and grass for reinforcement. The clay served as a refractory material capable of withstanding extreme heat. The furnace had one or more openings at the base for air supply and slag removal. The main fuel was not just wood, but charcoal. It was prepared in advance in special pits, slowly burning the wood without access to air. Charcoal burns at a much higher temperature than firewood and contains pure carbon, which is key to the entire process. A single smelting required a huge amount of coal, often several times the volume of the ore itself. The smelting process began with lighting a fire at the bottom of the furnace. Then the master began to methodically load the furnace in layers. A layer of charcoal, then a layer of prepared and roasted ore, then charcoal again, then ore again. This layer cake filled the entire furnace shaft. It was painstaking work that required precise calculations of proportions. The hardest work began after loading. To reach the required temperature, air had to be continuously supplied to the furnace. This was done using large hand bellows made of wood and leather. 2 or 3 people had to pump these bellows non-stop for many hours, forcing oxygen into the heart of the furnace. Inside the furnace, a real chemical reactor was unfolding. At temperatures above 1,000 degrees, the red-hot carbon from the charcoal began to actively steal oxygen from the iron oxides contained in the ore. This process is called reduction. Iron was released from the ore, but the temperature in such a furnace was not high enough to melt it. This process, which lasted many hours, required constant attention. What do you think was more difficult, maintaining the heat or pumping the bellows? In the next chapter, you will see what the blacksmith extracted from the cooled furnace. After long hours of fiery work and agonizing waiting, the most exciting moment arrived. The craftsmen dismantled the wall of the cooled or still hot furnace to extract what they had set out to achieve. At the bottom of the furnace, mixed with the remains of coal and solidified slag, lay the result of the smelting. It was the so-called pig iron, a shapeless, porous piece of reduced iron. The appearance of the bloom was far from that of a noble metal. It was a spongy, porous mass of dark grey or black color. Drops of slag had solidified in its pores and voids, and pieces of unburned charcoal had melted into it. The weight of such pig iron could range from a few kilograms to a dozen, depending on the scale of the smelting. This material was neither steel nor even pure iron. It was a raw material that in modern metallurgy would be called sponge iron. It was brittle, heterogeneous, and completely unsuitable for forging in the form in which it was extracted. Pig iron was only a semi-finished product, a blank full of impurities. The blacksmith's first task was to compact this material and get rid of most of the slag. The bloom was immediately sent to the hammer, either before it had cooled down or after being preheated in a forge until it was white hot. This was not delicate work, but rough and heavy primary forging. The blows of the heavy hammer literally squeezed the liquid slag out of the red-hot, spongy mass. Sparks and splashes of fiery liquid flew in all directions. This process was not only spectacular, but also critically important. The more slag that could be knocked out at this stage, the cleaner and higher quality the metal would be. Gradually, under dozens of powerful blows, the porous bloom became denser. It lost its spongy structure, turning into a more monolithic, though still very rough, bar of metal. This bar could already be considered pig iron, but it was still a long way from steel. Guess how many times the metal had to be folded before it was suitable for a sword? The bar of pig iron obtained from the bloom was still far from perfect. It contained many microscopic slag inclusions and was uneven in carbon content. To turn it into steel, the blacksmith resorted to the main method of purification and hardening, repeated forging and welding. This process, known as batch welding, was at the heart of the blacksmith's craft. The blacksmith took the bar, heated it in the furnace to a bright white glow, the temperature of blacksmithing. At this temperature, the surface of the metal became sticky, almost molten. He then pulled the bar onto the anvil and struck it rapidly. First, the bar was forged into a long strip. Then this strip was folded in half, reheated to welding temperature, and hammered. The two layers of metal were fused into a single monolithic piece under the blows of the hammer. This process was repeated over and over again. Forging, folding, welding. Each cycle served several purposes. First, with each folding and forging, another portion of harmful slag was squeezed out of the metal. The slag flowed out in the form of liquid sparks, and the metal became cleaner. Second, the inner layers of metal were mixed together like dough, making it more homogeneous. Most importantly, each time the metal was heated in the charcoal furnace, it absorbed carbon. This process is called carburization. Gradually, with each folding, the soft iron became saturated with carbon and turned into hard steel. The blacksmith controlled this process, relying solely on his experience. He could fold a bar dozens or even hundreds of times. 8 folds resulted in 256 layers of metal, and 10 folds resulted in more than 1,000. The metal became not only strong, but also acquired a layered internal structure similar to wood. This structure made it resistant to breaking. What do you think was more difficult, physical labor or the need to feel the metal? In the next chapter, we will see how blacksmiths solved the main problem, how to make a sword both hard and flexible at the same time. Blacksmiths in the Viking Age faced a fundamental dilemma known to weapon makers throughout history. A sword must have a very hard, cutting edge to stay sharp for a long time and pierce armor. But if the entire sword is made of hard, high-carbon steel, it will be as brittle as glass and break at the first strong blow. If it is made of soft, low-carbon iron, it will bend and quickly become dull. The solution to this dilemma was an ingenious technology called pattern welding, or as it is often called, Damascus steel. Although it is not exactly the same as the Damascus steel made in the Middle East, the principle of composite construction was similar. Scandinavian craftsmen created blades from several different types of steel, welding them together into a single piece. The heart of the blade was its core. To make it, the blacksmith took several strips of metal with different carbon contents, some harder, some softer. He twisted these strips into tight bundles, either separately or together. This process was incredibly difficult and required precise temperature control to make the metal malleable without breaking it. These twisted strands were then laid side by side and welded together with blacksmith welding into a single bar. This bar became the basis, the body of the future sword. Thanks to the combination of hard and soft layers, this core was incredibly strong and elastic. It could bend, absorbing the energy of the blow, and return to its original position without breaking. Twisting the strips was not only functional, but also aesthetic. After polishing and etching, a complex, beautiful pattern appeared on the surface of the finished blade, resembling streams of water, wood fibers, or intertwined snakes. This pattern was the master's calling card, direct proof of the complexity of the design and the high quality of the weapon. The presence of such a pattern was a source of pride for the owner. It showed that this was not a cheap, simple blade, but a high-tech product. In the sagas, such swords are often described as patterned or snake-like, which emphasizes their value. Having created a strong and resilient core from patterned welding, the blacksmith proceeded to the next crucial stage. The blade needed cutting edges. To do this, the master took the best material he had, pure high-carbon steel. He could obtain this steel through a long carbonization process or by selecting the best, hardest pieces from purified crucible steel. He forged 2 narrow strips from this steel. Then, after heating both the core and the strips to welding temperature, he welded them on both sides of the patterned core. This process was akin to a surgical operation. The blacksmith had to ensure a perfect connection of 3 different types of metal into a single monolithic bar. Now he had in his hands a blank that already contained the entire future structure of the sword. In the center was a tough, springy composite rod, and on the sides were strips of hard steel that would become the cutting edges. This structure was invisible to the eye, but it was the key to success. The stage of drawing and shaping the blade began. The blacksmith heated the blank again and again and forged it on the anvil. With hammer blows, he gradually stretched the bar in length, while simultaneously thinning it toward the edges and the tip. He had to make sure that all the layers were stretched evenly, without thinning or tearing. During this forging process, the master shaped all the elements of the blade's geometry. He created a smooth curve in the blades, known as the belly, which improved their cutting properties. He pulled back the tang, a narrow rod at the end of the blade to which the handle would later be attached. Each blow of the hammer was precise and measured, bringing the shapeless bar closer to the elegant contours of a sword. One of the most important elements that took shape at this stage was the fuller. This is a longitudinal groove running down the center of the blade. Contrary to popular myth, it was not intended to drain anything. Its function was purely engineering, like that of an I-beam in construction. Now came the moment of truth that determined the fate of the blade. This was the most dramatic and risky stage of the entire process: heat treatment. It was here that the blacksmith transformed a piece of well-forged metal into a real weapon. A mistake at this stage was fatal and could not be corrected. The process consisted of 2 key stages: hardening and tempering. To harden the blade, the blacksmith had to evenly heat the entire blade to a specific, critical temperature. This temperature depended on the carbon content of the steel, and the master determined it solely by eye, based on the color of the metal glowing in the dim light of his forge. He had to catch that very shade, cherry red or orange, when the crystal lattice of the steel was rearranging itself. If the blade was not heated enough, it would not harden. If it was overheated, the steel would burn, its structure would be irreversibly damaged, and it would become brittle. The blacksmith slowly rotated the blade in the furnace fire, achieving absolutely uniform heating along its entire length. Seizing the right moment, he acted with lightning speed. The blade was removed from the fire and immersed in the quenching medium with one quick, smooth movement. This could be water, oil, or a special salt solution. The secret of the composition of this liquid was often part of the master's professional secret. There was a loud hissing sound, and the forge was enveloped in clouds of steam. At that moment, a miracle occurred. Instant cooling froze the internal structure of the steel into a new, incredibly hard, but at the same time very brittle state known as martensite. The blade became as hard as glass. If it were dropped or struck at that moment, it would shatter into pieces. After the blade had undergone the baptism of fire through quenching and tempering, it was ready for its clothing. The handle, or hilt, was no less important a part of the sword than the blade itself. It provided balance, a comfortable grip, and served as the main decoration, reflecting the status of the owner. Assembling the hilt was a separate art, requiring the precision of a carpenter, carver, and jeweler. The basis of the hilt was the tang, a narrow strip of metal that was a continuation of the blade. All other parts were strung onto this tang like beads on a thread. First came the guard, or crossguard. This was a metal part that protected the hand. Viking guards were usually small and oval. Immediately after the guard came the handle itself. the part that the warrior held onto. Its base was carved from wood, horn, or even bone. The shape of the handle was ergonomic, often barrel-shaped, and carefully fitted to the tang. To ensure a secure grip, the wooden base could be wrapped with leather cord or wire. Its weight shifted the sword's center of gravity closer to the hilt, making the blade more mobile and obedient in the hand. Without the right pommel, the sword would feel heavy and clumsy. Its weight shifted the sword's center of gravity closer to the hilt, making the blade more mobile and obedient in the hand. Without the right pommel, the sword would feel heavy and clumsy. The pommels of Viking swords were true works of art. They often consisted of several parts and were richly decorated. Craftsmen used silver, copper, or brass inlays to create intricate, geometric patterns or images of animals. The wealthier the owner, the more luxurious the pommel of his sword. We have come a long way, from rusty dirt in a cold swamp to a shining blade that combines fire, steel, and the will of the craftsman. We have seen that a Viking sword was not just a weapon. It was a status symbol, the pinnacle of technology of its era, and the material embodiment of the spirit of the blacksmith who put his knowledge and strength into it. The process of its creation was a long, risky, and almost mystical act of creation. It required a deep understanding of nature, fire, and metal. The blacksmith took the most unassuming raw materials from the earth and, through the power of his craft, passed down from generation to generation, transformed them into a perfect object that combined beauty and lethal function. What other crafts from the Viking Age would you like us to recreate? Perhaps the construction of a drakkar, the secrets of runestones, or the art of chainmail making. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next journeys into the past.